And welcome back to the Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity. We've been speaking this hour to Dr. Rachel Harris, author of the book Listening to Ayahuasca. So I wanted to ask you, because the subtitle for your book is New Hope for Depression, Addiction, PTSD, and Anxiety. Why did you put all that in there?
Well, that sort of covers the waterfront, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's pretty much like, I know it's everything like our therapist deals with here in our center.
Right. Those are the most common things. Because that's what people are suffering with. And, you know, even as miraculous as the SSRIs, the antidepressants have been in the last couple of decades, there's still 30 to 50% who are not helped by them.
Right, and they're very toxic for the body, most SSRIs.
People don't really like the side effects.
Yeah.
They're real side effects.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's even, you know, I almost started to say the side effects of ayahuasca. Of course, there's purging during the ceremony.
Right.
But that's not really a side effect. There's no lasting side effect. People generally feel better the couple of days after.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before, then they take better care of themselves. And
it's actually a much safer, if we had ways to control and regulate the ceremonies, it would be a safer medicine.
Right.
Yeah, and I can say something about PTSD.
Yes,
people
please.
often report reliving childhood traumas or pieces of childhood history. And they report it in two ways. Sometimes they're actually reliving it. So they're 3 years old, they're in the middle of it. And that can be quite traumatic.
Right.
And, you know, we don't want people to get caught in that reliving again and again. And I have heard of cases of that.
Yeah.
And when that happens, that's almost re-traumatizing. And that person really needs intervention to get more distance. Other people report like watching a film of an experience they had in their childhood. It may be 3 years old too, but they know they're an adult watching this movie of their childhood. So that's already a therapeutic distance there, and enables them to have their adult presence about what happened to them and begin to see it differently. So
now your focus, we mentioned a little before about integration, but I mean your focus was really kind of not what happened in the ceremony as much as what happened after the ceremony for people.
And I'm really interested in the weeks and months afterwards, and what happens when someone is working with this medicine and is also in a therapeutic relationship. So they're in therapy, say, weekly. Maybe they go to a ceremony once every couple of months, whatever their preference is. But there's this sense of back and forth between the two experiences. But this assumes that the therapist has this kind of experience where they know how to work on these different levels and differentiate a psychological issue from a spiritual experience.
Yeah, I consider myself extremely fortunate because my wife does EMDR and she actually, you know, had talked about seeing her own EMDR therapist.
Yes.
But it wasn't until we started doing ceremonial work that she actually made the effort and talked to her supervisor and started working with her. And she would tell me about all these experiences. And sometimes the EMDR session, she said, was almost like a spiritual experience. So then eventually I actually started seeing the same therapist because she's very well known in the New York community in EMDR. And it like moved so quickly through it, and it really helped to integrate because EMDR is also not just a talk-based therapy.
It's very body-oriented.
It's very body-oriented, and I found that it really sort of exponentiated the process of the integration and what's happening. So it is, I mean, I guess this would be something you would agree with to recommend that, like, if you're doing ceremonial work, if you can also be seeing a therapist at the same time, like that's the best of both worlds.
I think that's the best of both worlds, as long as you have a therapist who can travel in all that inner landscape and territory and can differentiate between levels.
Right.
Yes, I think that's the best of both
And it was
worlds.
interesting because even though the therapist we used didn't have any experience with ceremonial work, she had a very spiritual practice and a very spiritual underpinning to herself, so she could work through the stuff.
She's traveled in her own inner territory, so she can recognize.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, about the research, I mean, what do you think are like sort of some of the key things? I mean, not everyone should go out and buy the book, of course, but what are some of the key things that your research revealed that you think is important for people to understand about what can happen after a ceremony?
Right. You know, My research and all the research that's going on about psychedelics, psilocybin mostly, really opens up the opportunity. The word that's used most often is recalibrate, reset, reorganize.
Right.
There's an opportunity to make different choices about how the person wants to structure themselves in their own life.
Right.
So there's a real chance to make basic changes that really change the trajectory of a life.
Right, and changes that normally take, if ever,
in therapy alone,
therapy alone,
right.
Decades to make.
And I think one of the central ones is, do I feel loved? And some of the quotes after an ayahuasca experience is, I can say I feel loved, I can say I love myself, but in the ceremony, I experienced being loved at a cosmic level that soaked all the way into my bones and my DNA, and that's a spiritual experience of feeling loved, and that begins to change everything.
Yeah. Now, you did, although you didn't have a control group per se, you did have a group that you compared some of the stuff to, right?
In the initial research and I don't really talk about that very much in the book, but I did have a comparison group. We don't really know how to do research with ayahuasca yet. We don't know how to control for the medicine. I think MAPS had a project they were developing where they were going to work with shaman, and they were going to use the capsules, the freeze-dried ayahuasca that's being used in Barcelona, where they can control the potency and the dosage.
Oh, really? I didn't know it's being used in Barcelona.
And they're doing a lot of research in Barcelona. So they had this all set up with the freeze-dried capsules. The shaman refused to work with it. They said the spirit is missing. So this is where we are with the beginning of the research, so you can see how far we have to go.
Right. So the book came out a couple of months ago.
Just about 6 weeks ago.
6 weeks ago. Initial reactions? How have people been responding to it?
I've been very pleased with how people are responding to the book. I kind of put my heart and soul into the book. Everything that came out of a lifetime of work, whether it was my own spiritual work or research or psychotherapy experience. It's really, the book itself is an integration of my career for me. And so you asked me offline, what's next? And I really don't know what's next. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to be called again or what would be called for. I don't know. But I kind of rose to do the job I was given.
Right. Do you have any intention behind this book? I mean, what do you hope would happen?
Yes, I have a very clear intention. I hope it's helpful for people. And I hope it's helpful for therapists working with people who are working with the medicine. And that it's useful for people considering, should I try this medicine, or for people afterwards. And I hope it encourages people to consider going to a therapist afterwards to really work with it, with all the potential possibilities.
Right. Now, this research you had done, a couple of years ago, it's been taking a little while to collate and analyze and put everything together. Do you see anything over the last couple of years shifting and changing in the landscape, in the medicine landscape?
Well, it's an underground medicine landscape.
Absolutely.
And so, the question is, who do you trust to go to a ceremony?
Right.
And is it someone who's had 6 months experience or a few years or not even 6 years? I mean, it really should be decades.
Yeah.
And in our culture, we kind of don't have a very good understanding of that, that it takes decades to really learn how to work with the medicine and the Icaros, which are the songs that people sing. And, so I'm very serious about that. And then on the other hand, somebody said to me, oh, yes, I've been to 5 or 6 ceremonies, and there's a DJ. They play recorded music. And I sort of want to tear my hair out. But then he talks about how he's benefited. And he's really experienced important therapeutic benefits. So I was glad I kept my mouth shut. But in general, I would tend to say, I hope the ceremonies retain their holistic ritual, where it's the medicine and the Icaros, the music, and that it's a complete ritual.
Right, and it retains its sort of spiritual quality to it, because it is a spiritual ritual.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm just curious, and not whether it's in the book or not, but just personally, have you learned more about sort of the indigenous culture behind these ceremonies for yourself personally?
Well, the indigenous culture can also be very dark.
Yeah.
And, some people who maybe are partially trained as shaman become infatuated with power and control, and they go off to the dark side. And there are terrible stories from indigenous shaman about attacks between shamans. So there's a dark side to this medicine.
You know what I just picked up again recently? I had read these books when I was in high school, and it's like I can barely remember anything. So I said, you know what, this is important. I need to read them again. I just picked up Teachings of Don Juan.
The Castaneda. I knew you were going there.
Books.
Yeah.
And I'm like reading it now, and it's, of course, I'm getting a very different message, and it's very interesting to revisit that body of work.
Right, and the power can go either way, and of course that's true for all of us.
Right. Yeah, and I just want to end on a point that for the one thing that I've learned is that there's also a real difference between the mestizo tradition in South America and tribal. And that, sort of after the conquistadors came in, the Indians did adapt somewhat of a patriarchal model from the Christianity, but really the true indigenous culture is much more tribal and less kind of hierarchical in a way. And there is a difference, and I've experienced there's a difference in those approaches towards ceremony.
I honestly I can't really speak to that. I don't really know for sure.
Yeah. One of my little things I've learned. Anyway,
okay, good.
I really appreciate you taking the time to come into studio
Thank you
today,
so
Dr.
much,
Harris. It was wonderful having you here. Let me hold it up for the Facebook live stream one more time. Listening to Ayahuasca by Dr. Rachel Harris. Go out and get the book. It's a wonderful book. Anybody involved with ceremonial work, thinking about getting involved with ceremonial work, this is an invaluable resource. So thank you, Dr. Harris, and
thank you so much.
I hope all the best for you. And so for all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in today. I really want to encourage people, if you have not yet signed up for our newsletter, please go to the website if you've not already, Talkradio.nyc, and sign up for our newsletter so that you can be aware of the different shows and different topics coming up, so you can see the amazing offerings that we have. I highly encourage that. Well, it's the end of another show. Thank you all for tuning in and listening. Thank you all for the Facebook live stream listeners. Of course, it'll be available afterwards, and we will have more shows available for you, and we will talk to you next week.
You're listening to the Talking Alternative Network.
Hello, I'm JC.
I'm Joan.
And welcome to 21st Century Entrepreneur. We bring education,
insight,
knowledge,
awareness,
trouble,
craziness, and fun
for you, the entrepreneur who's looking to build your business
and your community. Listen